I'm running out of time because I got to do this interview. So let us go to Jordan Peterson. And like I said, terrific, really interesting interview. Dr. Jordan Peterson, a Canadian clinical psychologist, cultural critic, and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and also a heroic battler for free speech. He's the author of Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, and 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, and the host of the Jordan B. Peterson podcast and the YouTube channel where he has some tremendous videos at Jordan Peterson Videos. Dr. Peterson, thank you for coming back. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Can you bring us up to date on this battle you've been having? Is it Bill C-16? Many people probably have lost this plot, and I just would like to know what the latest is on this. If you could remind us what the bill is first.
Bill C-16 was a measure federal measure that purported only to extend basic human rights protection to people who varied in their gender identity and their gender expression. But the problem I had with it was the background policy information that accompanied it, especially on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website, that seemed to indicate that addressing people by their preferred pronouns would be mandatory, and along with another number of other what would you call policy recommendations that I thought were serious infringements on freedom of speech and freedom of thought and conscience. And so that became a big story in Canada, and I went with a couple of other people to testify before the Canadian Senate against the bill, but it passed. It passed through the Senate and will be legislation in Canada, as it already is in many provinces. So we lost that one.
Does that mean there will now be penalties for not calling a man she if he decides he's a woman?
Well, not only that, the penalties are there if you use non-standard pronouns, like Z and Zer and these made-up pronouns that no one except for a very tiny minority of people use in common language. And that was another reason I objected to it, because I think of these what would you call constructed pronouns as the vanguard of a particular kind of radical left-wing authoritarianism, in my view. And that was my primary reason for stating publicly that I would refuse to use them, especially when they're mandated. So there's never been a law in Canada like that where you were compelled to use certain words by the government.
Will you refuse to use them?
Yes, definitely.
And what do you know what the penalty for that is?
No, they've not really specified that. I mean, what would happen is you would end up dragged before the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and that's, I would say, an extrajudicial kangaroo court, and they would make their decision there. And there's all sorts of potential penalties that might be assessed: financial, forced educational retraining, potential loss of professional status. And then if you refuse to comply with the recommendations of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, if you reject them, then they can bring you into normal court and use whatever punishments are available under the normal court system. And so has your stance interfered with your teaching career, your work? Well, the university was pretty ambivalent about what I was doing to begin with, and they sent me 2 letters asking me to stop saying what I was saying. I think they were as confused by the new legislation, which also applies to the province, as I was, and they certainly didn't expect the sort of backlash against what I was saying. But I would say the University of Toronto has actually come around pretty good since then. I've received a lot of popular support, especially from journalists, because they're also obviously concerned about free speech. And I think once the university sorted itself out in some sense, then they decided it would be best just to leave me alone. Or I wouldn't say they're supporting me precisely in my stance, you know what I mean, because They're not going to do that. But they definitely have pulled away from any potential censoring of me. And I taught again in January, and the students were very welcoming. So I think that's been straightened out quite nicely. And I think the University of Toronto is moving in the direction of the University of Chicago with regards to, protection of free speech and the primacy of classic liberal values over social justice. That's what it looks like. I'm sure hoping that's the case.
So you've lost a battle, but the war goes on, and you may actually win that in the long run.
Well, and it raised a lot of public opinion, I mean, so although we lost the battle with regards to that specific legislation, it certainly doesn't seem like the war was wrong, and quite the contrary. I mean, one of the things it's done is bring the other work I've done on ideology and personal responsibility to a huge audience, and so that's been completely overwhelming, but also, well, extraordinarily fortunate and beneficial for me. So I can't say that the net outcome was negative by any stretch of the imagination. And there are more and more people, including academics, who are starting to push back against the domination of the universities by these postmodern Marxist ideologues. So it's gone too far, and virtually anyone sensible can see that. So maybe it'll be receding. You never know.
So here's another subject that I really want to talk to you about. You have got a series of videos on the Bible. And I have to tell you that a young man in Australia wrote a Facebook post and then did a video in which he said, Jordan Peterson has been my gateway drug to Christianity. He started by listening to you, and he ended up, the poor man, reading my book, and then had a conversion experience. What are you teaching these poor people that leads them down the primrose path to me, of all things? And what are you saying about the Bible?
Well, I've studied mythology and symbolism for a very long time, and the first book I wrote, and to some degree the second one, which is 12 Rules for Life, deal a lot with the psychological significance of mythological stories. Now, I'm not necessarily speaking specifically about the religious significance, because I'm not well, I wouldn't say that's my primary area of expertise, because I'm a psychologist. But I started this biblical series, which is on YouTube. I've done 12 lectures, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through Genesis. I'm trying to make a case for the ethos that's laid out in the narrative structure of the Old Testament, and then eventually the New Testament. And what I'm arguing for is the importance of the idea of logos that saturates the biblical texts. And logos is the power of communicative speech, and it's given a world-shaping form in the biblical stories. So God, for example, creates order out of chaos at the beginning of time with speech, and that speech, that communicative, honest, truthful speech, is also associated with the figure of Christ, who's the redemptive figure. And so from a psychological perspective, one of the ideas that's being put forth is that human beings who are made in the image of God, let's say, participate in the process of creation in a positive way when they use truthful, responsible speech, because that shapes the potential that's in front of us towards the good instead of towards hell, essentially. And so that's the case I've been making. And that idea emerged out of an underlying narrative structure, right? It wasn't explicit and philosophical to begin with. It was acted out in drama and ritual. I also talk a fair bit about the idea of sacrifice, which is a big concept, a major concept in the Old Testament. And from a psychological perspective, the significance of sacrifice is absolutely overwhelming, because to discover sacrifice is to learn that you can give up something of value in the present and gain something of greater value in the future. And that's really the discovery of the future, and it's the discovery of responsibility and of reputation and all of those things. So the whole idea that you could alter your behavior in the present in a conscious manner so that you could make a bargain with nature, fate, and mankind was embedded in the idea of sacrifice. And that's something that's worth thinking about for like 10 years. It's an unbelievably brilliant realization, and it's something that's only really characteristic of people. So,
you know, a while back, I noticed that I started to read a lot of books by intellectuals and professors that made the following. I'm thinking of books like Education's End by Anthony Kronman over at Yale, and Why We Should Call Ourselves Christians by Marcello Pera, I think he was a senator in Italy, and Whatever Happened to Modernism by a terrific critic, Gabriel Josipovici. And all of them were started to make the same case from different places. But the case was basically this, that Christianity is the underpinning of or judeo-Christianity, if you like, is the underpinning of our civilization. Without it, our civilization would collapse. But they couldn't quite grasp the nettle of belief themselves. And when I listen to some of your videos, I sort of hear that same position. Am I right in that, or am I making a mistake?
Well, elaborate a bit more. You mean with regards to like explicit belief in God?
Yes,
explicit
is
that what you mean?
belief in God and in Christ, in Christianity specifically, I think.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by belief, at least in my case. And I wouldn't say that I've necessarily got that completely sorted out in my own mind, which is partly why I'm doing these lectures. Like, I'm doing the lectures to figure out what I think. So, I'm figuring it out as I go along, essentially. I'm doing a lot of background research. And I'm also trying to restrict my commentary to what I regard as psychologically valid rather than theologically relevant, So I'm not denying the possibility of meaning in these biblical texts beyond the psychological. But I don't feel that I have the expertise to comment on it beyond that. Now, I do know, and I have made this case, the case that human beings are capable of profound religious experience, and that we even know how to induce those experiences, is overwhelming. And I don't know of any of the modern atheist types, for example, who've been able to explain that. So it's a very difficult thing to explain. And there's common patterns of religious experience across cultures. And generally, the scientific findings are that people who have profound religious experiences, which can be invoked, for example, by pharmacological means upon occasion, benefit extraordinarily from those experiences. So you can't make a straight scientific case that's anti-deist. Although you can say, the thing is you can't prove by the mere fact that people are capable of religious experiences that God necessarily exists, right? Because those experiences are subjective.
Right.
So, but you certainly have to proceed with the observation that the religious experience is built into human beings at a very deep level, and even at an evolutionary level, which is part of the case that I'm making in this biblical series, because I'm also trying to bridge the gap between evolutionary theory and religious thinking. That needs to be done. I mean, the Catholics have already sorted that out to some degree, but
Yeah.
the evangelicals haven't to the
right.
same degree.
But I mean, the thing about the induced experience, which I think is always a really interesting point, we are capable of, for instance, experiencing that it is raining, and I have no doubt that some clever scientist could induce the experience that it is raining in us. But the question of faith is whether or not it is actually whether or not you believe it is actually raining. So, I mean, I think that the question of faith is the question of whether that religious experience refers to anything in reality. And and I have to say, and I hope this doesn't come across in the wrong way. I'm not a preacher and I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I saw a video of you where you were asked directly, "Do you believe in God?" And you sounded so much like me about 3 years before I was baptized that it almost made me laugh, because you wanted to sort of keep it in the realm of ideas, and yet there is this question, and it's a powerful question for intellectuals like yourself, because I think that if intellectuals ultimately feel that they can't believe, then I feel that there's no trickle down to everybody else. If there's no intellectual foundation for faith, then basically there will be no faith. So it's actually an important question. Yeah.
Well, it is an important question, and I've got two things to say about that. Is one, there's elements of that question that affect me in a private manner, in a way that makes me unwilling to respond.
Fair enough.
Because I'm not sure that my response and the question would be on the same plane of meaning, so to speak. And it's easy to say that I'm weaseling out of it, but I've learned to not say things when there's something inside me that says not to say them. Mm-hmm. And so that's one realm. But the other thing I would say is that I think that it's more reasonable to consider what someone believes in terms of how they act. And I certainly act as if or I do my best, I should qualify that. I do my best to act as if there's like a sovereign moral entity that's at the root of being. And I think even if that's only true in a psychological sense, that doesn't make it trivial by any stretch of the imagination. That was part of Carl Jung's observation, right. Because he thought of internal psychological unity, psychological and physiological unity, so the unified mind in a unified body, as something that was an approximation to the self and also to Christ, which I think is an extraordinarily interesting idea, because from a psychological perspective, you can think of Christ as the perfect man. Now, he's also represented as a union of divine and human. But I think that people are a strange union of divine and human. And the divine part is part of the fact that we have this capacity for religious experience and for transcendent experience, and that we're actually conscious, and that our consciousness seems to have a world-creating form. And those are all things I'm certain of. They seem very, very solid. Now, what exactly that implies, I can't say, because I can't understand it. There's an indescribable relationship, as far as I'm concerned, between consciousness and being. And I don't think that materialist reductionists have dealt with that issue at all.
Right.
Now,
right.
there's serious philosophers who have, like Heidegger, for example, and serious psychologists like Jung, who've also dealt with it. But we have no idea, for example, how the brain produces consciousness, and we have no idea what the relationship is between consciousness and being itself, and it's something that even perplexes the physicists. So,
unfortunately, I have to end. I would talk to you for another hour gladly, but they're telling me to wrap up. I think I really, and by the way, I don't think you're weaseling out. First of all, because I think your faith is nobody's business but your own, and secondly, because I think you have to take every journey honestly. And I have to say, I think your stuff is great, and you are journeying honestly. I'd much rather see an honest man confront the questions than hear somebody just preach it from the book. And I think it's terrific. I hope you'll come back and talk about this more. It's just a fascinating question to me, and it is fascinating to watch intellectuals grapple with what I think is the failure of relativism and the failure of postmodernity at some level.
Yeah, well, we are a judeo-cristian culture, and if we don't understand the foundation on which we rest, then we're going to fall.
Absolutely.
So that's what it looks like to me.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you very much. I hope you'll come back and we'll talk again.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
Nice to see you again.
Bye-bye. That was a really interesting interview. I mean, it's really fascinating to watch a guy of that level grapple with questions of faith. I think a lot of people are doing it behind the scenes, and I really do believe we are in the midst of an underground revolution in faith among the intellectuals, and I think it will trickle down to the rest of us. And I think it's a really good thing. Everybody laughs at me when I say this. They think it's only going to go one way, but it's not. It's going to change. It really is.